오늘은 제가 정말 애정하고 자주 사용하는 클라우드 GPU 플랫폼 런팟의 공동창업자 겸 CEO인 젠루님을 직접 모셔서 이야기 나누려고 합니다. 오늘 대화에는 흥미로운 이야기들이 많이 있는데요. 잠시 예고해드리자면 가정용 게이밍 GPU와 기업용 AI GPU는 무엇이 다른지, 최고의 AI 인재들이 연봉만큼이나 GPU 접근성을 중요하게 생각하는 이유, GPT처럼 뛰어난 AI가 이미 많은데도 왜 우리에게 맞춤형 AI 시스템이 필요한지, 그리고 지하실에 있었던 단 20개의 GPU로 시작해 어떻게 글로벌 플랫폼이 될 수 있었는지 그 흥미로운 비하인드 스토리까지 모두 들려드립니다. 마지막에는 이제 막 AI 개발에 입문하는 분들을 위한 젠루 대표님의 진심 어린 조언까지 담겨 있으니 채널 고정해주세요. Hi Jen, thank you so much for your time. Today I'd love to focus on key topic for our audience, how to go from simply using AI to actually building their own custom AI systems.
That's a super exciting topic. I'd love to talk to you about it.
My hope is that our conversation can serve as a clear guide for them, and they can hear RunPod's vision directly from you.
Sure. I'm not entirely sure if we can provide detailed guidance in 30 minutes, but I hope to at least be inspirational.
But before we begin, could you please briefly introduce yourself and your role at RunPod for our viewers?
Sure. My name is Zhen Lu. I am one of the co-founders of RunPod, one of two. Currently hold the position of CEO. Started RunPod a little over 3 years ago. It's been a very exciting ride since we started.
Okay, let's start with basics. For someone new to this, how would you explain what cloud computing is in simple terms?
Sure, yeah. Cloud computing is a pretty loaded term, but to make it as simple as possible, when computers were first invented, right, they were giant machines. You needed an entire building or room to house them. So they started as very specialized and only a select group of people had access to them. Once the technology matured, the machines got smaller. And so now you know that you can have a laptop or a desktop in your home, which is quite magical. That allows you to do a lot of very cool things. However, when you need to do things like maybe train a model, or when you need to do things like scale up so that you can serve hundreds or thousands or even millions of customers, you no longer can rely on your single machine at home, or even if you buy many machines. So that's where cloud computing comes in. That's where somebody else has purchased that hardware on your behalf, and you can use it through the cloud, right? Through the internet. So that means that you don't have to worry about purchasing the machines. You don't have to worry about, can you get the machines enough power, right? Are they running cleanly? Are they running coolly? All you need to worry about is your software.
Building on that, what is a cloud GPU? How is it different from the graphic card someone might have in their gaming computer at home?
Yeah, there's a few ways that I would like to approach that question. So number one, not all cloud GPUs are actually different from the GPU that you might have in your computer at home, depending on how powerful that GPU is. For example, right now, the best home GPUs are like 5070s, 5080s, 5090s. These are really for gaming, right? NVIDIA sells them to consumers for gaming. However, they actually have very, very good AI use as well. For 5090s, they are among the most price per performance leaders. And so being able to run those as cloud GPUs is actually quite interesting, but only for specific use cases. When you are doing things like image models, when you're trying to generate videos, maybe some audio, there's a lower VRAM requirement. And so it can fit in a consumer GPU. And so then it's just a matter of getting more of them and scaling them. Now, there are also enterprise GPUs. You may have heard of A100s or H100s or H200s or even B200s. Now, these are quite different. And the major difference is actually memory bandwidth. It's how fast can these GPUs shuttle around data. This is very important when you're dealing with things like LLMs, like, if you're going to interact with something like ChatGPT, it's going to need to run on something much larger. Now, the consequence of this is that they also cost a lot more money. So if you are looking at a B200 fully loaded server, one server costs could cost 500,000 US dollars.
Wow.
So we are talking about like these servers cost as much as houses or more than houses. And I don't see that really changing at the top end anytime soon. I imagine a future where perhaps these things become incredibly cheap to purchase and run, and everybody can have access to them. But for right now, if you're looking for being on the cutting edge, it's extremely expensive. The other facet that really needs to be pointed out is if you've ever run a high-end gaming GPU and you've kept up with it over the last decade or so, you would have noticed that the power requirements for these GPUs is getting more and more. So I actually build PCs. I built PCs for 20 years, and it's super interesting. Like back in the day, you could get away with a much smaller power supply. You were buying power supply of 200 watts, right? Now we're seeing power supplies of 1,600 watts. And people are buying 1,600 power supplies just to run a single consumer card. Now, you can imagine if you were trying to run an entire server, and these servers usually have about 8 cards in them, how much power that takes. And it's quite different from a CPU server. Because CPU server, data centers are all designed for that. You can cram a lot of them in a very small amount of space. So you get very high compute density. And they've already figured out it's kind of a solved problem. How do you cool these things? How do you provide power? If you go to a GPU data center that is not a modern data center, they tried to put GPUs in an existing data center, you will see that it quite looks empty because there's one rack. And in order to provide that rack enough cooling and enough power, you can't put a lot of stuff near it. So the density from a hardware perspective has gone down by quite a lot. And so many data center providers are looking for ways of how do they actually make this more dense and more efficient. And then lastly, it's very stupid stuff. It's these things are super heavy. You put a rack of these GPUs on the floor, and a lot of the floors of traditional data centers are not designed to handle the weight. So people have put racks there and it's actually damaged their floor or actually even fallen through the floor. And so these are things that I feel if you are a consumer at home, you don't realize how complicated just the logistics of the utility are. And that's the benefit of Cloud GPU. You don't have to worry about all of these things. You can just use it through the internet, and it's really, really cool.
I can actually feel that my computer consumption has increased significantly. The power consumption on my computer is rising from 600 watts to 1,000 watts.
Yeah. And you start to see that as more of a dent in your electricity bill, but at least you're doing cool stuff with it.
Yes. And next question. Why is having access to powerful GPUs is so critical in today's AI-driven world? What kind of task, like training models or learning apps like Stable Diffusion, would be possible without them?
Yeah, I would say that it's kind of two things. One is if you want to be anywhere near the frontier, unfortunately, you do require larger amounts of compute and larger amounts of VRAM. This is the reason why the large frontier labs are recruiting talent, not only by offering them a lot of cash in terms of compensation, but they're promising access to a large amount of GPUs. It's because if you really want to do research at the cutting edge and you want to innovate, a lot of times you need a lot of compute. Now, that's not always the case, right? If you don't necessarily need to be the one creating the next ChatGPT or the next Claude, and you want to be instead, let's say, training a new model for trying on clothes, for example, you can technically do that with a smaller amount of compute. You might even be able to give it a run on your home PC. But the other limiting factor is really the thing that limits a lot of software development in general and innovation in general. It's the iteration time. How quickly can you iterate? Can you experiment, find what's good and find what's bad? And even if you have a very powerful home PC, the speed at which you can iterate is drastically limited because you're more or less single-threaded, right? You can run the one experiment, and then it might take you hours or even days or even weeks. And then if it doesn't turn out well, then you have to run another one. So being able to do things in a highly parallel fashion is incredibly important when you are interested in getting results. And right now, AI is moving very, very quickly. So the ability for you to iterate quickly is incredibly important.
Okay, I think our conversation leads us perfectly to RunPod. Could you tell us the story behind LongPath? What problem did you see in the market that you wanted to solve?
Yeah, I'll try to give you an abbreviated version. So Pardeep and I worked together at a pretty large company for about 6 years. And over the course of that time, we really valued each other. We found that we worked very well together and there was a lot of overlap in our technical ability. However, I must admit that Pardeep, my co-founder, is a much better engineer than I am. He has an almost magical intuition of how to solve problems. We could always just say, here's a big problem, how do we solve it? And Pardeep will be able to come up with an elegant solution almost unfairly. And I was able to be good enough to earn his respect and to be able to tell him sometimes, hey, maybe we need to think about this, or let's not do that. That one's a bit too crazy. The strength that I brought to the table was quite early on when I joined the team. I recognized that our hiring practices were not super great. So I actually took over hiring for the team, and we went from a team of about 8 people to almost 100 people by the time that we reached our peak. So during that time, we actually got a chance to work on quite a lot of interesting projects, one of which involved machine learning and data science applied across the national footprint of telemetry. So it was a huge problem to solve because we were actually grokking the data from most of the cable modems in the United States. Large data, large impact. And so we were seeing the power of machine learning, fairly early on. So then kind of switching gears, one day I started talking to Pardeep. I said, hey, have you ever thought about mining Ethereum? Just as kind of like a topic of conversation. And we had maybe a 10, 15-minute conversation about this. And I thought, good conversation. Next thing I know, 2 weeks later, Pardeep has purchased quite a lot of Ethereum mining hardware in GPUs and server parts. And he basically came to me and said, okay, Zhen, I'm ready to go. I said, what do you mean you're ready to go? He said, well, we talked about this and, I'm good. I said, okay, I guess we were doing this. So I ended up purchasing some hardware as well and we got started. It was actually very fun, right? Because we got to learn a lot about hardware. We got to learn a lot about the software and the technology as well. However, after about a month, we kind of learned most of what we needed to know. Everything was set up and it was super boring actually, because the machines are just there and they're just supposed to print you money. And we're like, well, that's super boring. What else can we do with GPUs? We've convinced our spouses to allow us to, invest in these GPUs. And we're like, okay, well, what if we did some deep learning? And so when we explored the deep learning stack, we were like, well, this is really awful. It's just a pain to use these things. There has to be something better. And so we did a little bit of searching, and there wasn't really. So we said, okay, we feel that this is going to be bigger. Workloads are going to need this kind of compute, and the software stack isn't there. So not being people with a whole ton of money, we were like, what can we do? We're software developers, so let's go and create some software to try to make this better. So that was the first version of RunPod. We actually developed it in our spare time over the course of several months. The whole point was, how do you really operationalize the GPUs in a way that is easier to use, in a way that people can iterate very quickly? As I'd mentioned earlier, iteration and speed of iteration is really the lifeblood of software development. So can we get people to spin up a batteries included environment where they can really do what they want to do, and then be able to tear it down and repeat that very, very quickly? And so we actually launched it not knowing what we were doing on a Reddit post, actually. We said, we built a platform. We think it's a pretty good MVP. It's completely free. We were hosting it on the servers that we were previously using for Ethereum mining. We reconfigured them into deep learning machines. And so it was just running off of some stuff in my basement, in Pardeep's basement. And we got incredibly lucky. We had a lot of community members that, or even early users that turned into community members that really supported us. The feedback early on was, hey, this is pretty awesome. Can you please take our money? And we were like, that sounds like pretty good feedback to us. So that's how RunPod got started.
So how many GPUs did RunPod have when it first started?
Yes. So when we first started, we actually only had, I think, 20 total GPUs across 3 servers. So like I said, we're not rich people. That's about as much as we could afford to put into it. But we did make sure to take some time and care into speccing the servers correctly. They were using consumer GPUs. So at the time, we had some 3090s, some 3080s, and some 3070s.
Okay, and it seemed the market is evolving. I've heard RunPod is now focusing on enabling developers to build, deploy, and scale custom AI systems. Let's start there. What exactly does RunPod mean by a custom AI system?
Yeah, this is something that quite transparently is evolving over time. However, if you are not really deep into AI, probably the best way I can explain it is this. When we first started in generative AI, all of the commotion, and still kind of is at the surface, was around what model are you running? And so it was very model centric. In a world where you have this magical model, you can ask it a question, it gives you an answer, right? So the very early things were in image. It's I prompt for an image, you give me an image, right? Super simple. In LLMs or text, it's I ask a question, I get an answer. Now, very quickly, you realize that it feels magical when you start. However, you need some guardrails around it. And it's also extremely expensive. If you want to run a very huge model to give you the best answers, that's very expensive. And then also, it might not give you very intelligent answers all the time. And so to solve these problems, AI systems are needed. So AI systems are not only the model or maybe even multiple models that you need to answer a question or to give you the right output, but also all of the orchestration and glue, if you will, to tie it into a cohesive experience. So nowadays, if you are using an AI product, chances are it's not just a single model where you directly ask it a question and it gives you an answer. You actually have to go through a lot of infrastructure and a system where maybe there's routing. For example, GPT-5, right, is trying to go this route where it actually routes you to a different model depending on how complicated it thinks your question is. Now, there's obviously a lot of internet blowback on how well they do this. However, that is the future, right? You cannot just run the most expensive thing for every single thing. And actually what we found is that in a lot of cases, a smaller, more specialized model will be able to give you better answers than a large, very generic model. And so we feel that the custom AI system is how do you get the right models for the right use cases? And then how do you glue them together to really make sure that the user experience feels increasingly magical? And in order to do that, you need a lot more moving parts. It is more complicated, but in my mind, that's where the future of AI goes.
What do you think a difference between the routing system and the mixture of experts?
Yeah, it really comes into at what abstraction level you are working at. So a lot of the mixture of experts models are actually at the model architecture level. And so the model itself needs to be comprised of a mixture of experts. And you can almost think about it, if you want to think about it this way, the router is baked into the model and the serving of the model. Now, if you want to think about then there's a level above where it can abstract, where you can say, I can have a mixture of experts in a routing system, where this mixture of experts is actually mixing. It's actually not a routing of experts. Most mixture of experts actually need to activate multiple experts for, one question. And it might even do that in a pretty innovative way. But you can imagine that an AI system might have multiple models that employ mixture of experts. And it could have, like, you ask a question, the first mixture of experts gives it your best shot, right? And then it comes out, there might be some traditional parsing and guardrails around, is that an acceptable answer? And then once you've taken that, maybe it goes to another judging model, which could also be a mixture of experts. It could be a smaller model as well. And so it's really, where do you how much determinism and how much control do you have? How much of it's code and how much of it is like neural network? Andrej Karpathy actually has a really good talk about like the different versions of software. And he talks about software 1.0 versus 2.0 versus 3.0. And so you could also think about it like that, where software 3.0 is more on the neural networks and like you don't really understand it as a human being kind of thing. Whereas like the AI systems is, how are you gluing together the neural networks with things that are more traditionally thought of as software, right? So this is like databases. These are CPU determinism code. So that kind of stuff. It's like, how do you merge them together? Now, perhaps there's a future farther down the line where all you need is the neural network, right? Because it's so advanced now, we don't have to really understand it. It just does everything very magically. I think we're a ways away from that, despite everybody's talk about, AGI or ASI. But that might be the future.
Okay, the custom AI systems are a very powerful concept, I think. So how does RunPod specifically make it easier for a developer to build one of these custom systems compared to using other cloud giants or tools?
Yeah, it really comes down to, I believe that you should use tools that are made for what you want to do. I actually used to, and I still enjoy it, but I don't have as much time. I used to really enjoy woodworking. And if you've ever done any type of woodworking or craft in the physical world, you will realize that if you have the right tools for the job, it makes your job a lot easier. And you don't have to be as much of an expert, right? If you think about, if I want to make something and everything needs to be done by hand, I don't have measurement tools, I don't have electric tools, it's going to be very, very difficult. And you can do it, but you need a lot of skill. And you probably need to be doing that for your entire life. Otherwise, it's going to look like garbage. And I've been there. I've built things that look really, really bad. The analogy holds for software development. If you have the right tools for the job, it makes your life a lot easier. So RunPod was built specifically to be AI first. It might sound pretty dumb, but one of the big things that we've realized is storage and moving data around is hugely important for this. And for the larger companies that want to serve all use cases, whether that's running a traditional app to training a model, they aren't really built for a specific use case. And so they have to be very general, and it's not very good from a developer experience perspective. Whereas with RunPod, we are only interested in running AI workloads. We've done a lot of work to make the caching faster for models. We've done a lot of work to make sure that the machines themselves are spec'd specifically for the type of workloads that our customers want to run. And then we also make it so that when you come to the user interface and you interface with the platform, it's very scoped towards AI. So everything that you're seeing is AI focused, and that makes it a lot easier to actually do your work, because you're not like, oh, do I use this random product or this random product? When there are hundreds of them, it gets very, very confusing very fast.
In these days, many are now familiar with large models like GPT-5 or Claude. Why would a company need to build their own custom system when these powerful tools exist? What are the limitations they face that make a custom approach necessary?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really comes down to the fact that for general cases, models like GPT, like Claude, are really powerful because you don't have to necessarily do as much thinking, and you can just ask it something random, and you'll generally get a fairly good answer. However, when you are thinking about aspirationally, how am I going to create something that is new, right? As human beings, we are really valuing new things, innovation. And so the next generation of software is going to be built to provide new experiences for people. And so giving you an example, one of our customers does a virtual trying on application. So when you are going to a store, it's like, I don't want to have to physically go and try on the clothes. I want to be able to see myself in those clothes. And now this is something that people have tried to do in the past. This company has done it, and they actually tried using like a GPT image, right, for this. And they found that GPT image is very good for generating general, like Ghibli, like whatever. Like, it can generate you a general type of image, but it's not super good at generating this specific type of image, because you need to take into account a lot of details, right? You need to take into account like the cut of the clothes. Consistency is very important. Keeping your frame, like how your measurements are, the draping of the clothes, like it needs to really look realistic. Otherwise, it doesn't matter, right? It's just a toy. And so what they found is they could not get away from being able to fine-tune their own model and integrate that into their own AI system. So the TLDR there is that I believe if you really want to create innovative experiences in AI, you probably at some point, even if you don't have to start there, because I would encourage people, if they're going to start somewhere, you probably should start with something that's easier, but you will generally run into a wall. And so then your choice is, I can wait for GPT or Claude to catch up and enable me, or I can try to break through that wall. And the way to break through that wall is really building your own custom AI system.
For a creator or developer who is now convinced they need to build their own AI system, what's one key piece of advice you would give them for getting started with RunPod?
Yeah, I'll give general advice that's not necessarily RunPod specific first, and goes back to iteration, right? Do not expect it to work perfectly the first time.
Okay.
A lot of the innovation that's happening right now is actually what I would call guided brute force, right? Because these things are not super well understood. It's not like, I go back to using the word deterministic. It's not like you write some clean code and it will be good, right? It's you know that it does what you need it to do. If you have bugs, you can fix them because you know why they're there, and you can fix them because you understand it. A lot of things that have to do with models, right? Non-deterministic, you don't understand it. And so you can definitely educate yourself on what the tuning parameters mean, right? You can reason about what kind of effects you might see. However, a lot of it right now is like an art and a science. It's like, I'm going to try this, and I'm also going to try this, and I got to run a lot of experiments to see what works. And that might be very frustrating at first, but you need to really go in with the expectation that things are going to be weird. You're not necessarily going to know exactly what the solution is, and you're going to have to just try things until you find something that really is cool and that's getting you in the right direction, and then you can iterate in that direction. So very much an iterative approach that is going to be very, very hard to understand. Now, for specifically on RunPod, I believe that you've got a few different options. One is that we have historically had a template system that allows people to share kind of the things that they've created with other people. We've also recently released our community hub. Eventually, the template system will make it in and integrate into the community hub. But the TLDR there is that getting to be part of a community, going into RunPod's community, looking at what other people have done, unless you are already an expert, and let's face it, most people I myself would not count myself as an expert because there are like probably 10 people in the entire world that could really call themselves experts in this field, right? And in the absence of being an expert, it makes a lot of sense to learn together. And so to really lean on what other people are learning and learning alongside them and sharing your learning, it's the basis of how open source software works. And I think that's the basis of how we're going to be able to, as human beings, be able to make cooler and cooler AI.
I recently tried using Hub, and it was definitely convenient for deployment.
Yeah. The idea is that people should be able to share the cool stuff that they've built. I believe that one of the reasons to build things is to share it with others, right? And so hopefully that will empower other people to be able to create cool and exciting things and to be able to share that, and then we can all grow together.
Our YouTube channel is watched not only by individual developers and creators, but also by many business leaders and entrepreneurs who are looking for the right technology for their companies. So thinking from their perspective, I have a couple of questions about RunPod's position in the corporate world. First, for companies considering a new cloud platform, who is the ideal customer profile for RunPod?
Yeah, it's really customers that are going to prioritize time to value, right? These are the customers that are not the companies that are like, I would say that if you are running a bank, for example, RunPod, you could use RunPod. We are well on our way to becoming a trusted provider. However, you're likely going to want to run on, I'll use the word boring infrastructure, because it's not that you necessarily want to innovate quickly. Actually, the risk tolerance is very low because you're dealing with people's money and things just cannot break, period. Whether that's from your infrastructure, whether that's from your developer. And so the speed at which you iterate is actually less important. It's more about how do you make sure that what you build is good and boring and works. However, if you are on the iterative path, if you are a startup or if you are a business that really needs to make something entirely new, and it's okay, and you have the risk tolerance that it doesn't necessarily work all the time because models just don't work all the time, then being able to onboard onto RunPod and quickly iterate, right, is actually a meaningful experience versus going to a hyperscaler cloud like AWS, where a lot of it is really on you. It's on you to provision the right amount of compute. It's on you to choose the right frameworks. It's on you to figure out how to blow things up and start over. There's a lot of implementation optimizations that RunPod does on your behalf, and it's also a guided experience. So if you just want to be able to get started and start creating value and iterate quickly, that's the type of customer that really benefits from RunPod the most.
Okay, you answered the second question as well. Let's move on the last question. Looking ahead, what excites you the most about the future of AI? And what is RunPod's vision for its role in empowering creators and businesses to build these systems?
Yeah, I would say the most exciting thing for me is that we're in a time where software development is getting redefined. And it's getting redefined quickly, but not so quickly as everything is already there. Like one of the things about traditional software development, it's not like traditional software development has been around for all that long, right? Couple decades, but it's matured, right? A lot of things have kind of calcified. There's kind of the right way of doing things. Even then, it's pretty confusing. I am a self-taught software developer. I actually used to be in academia. I taught myself how to program. And when I first started, I remember having this feeling, I'm like, how the hell am I supposed to learn any of this stuff? There's so much to learn. However, there are a lot of resources out there, and I eventually was able to pick a path and learned along that path. And now I'm looking at AI and software development, and it's gotten even worse. It's like 10 times, 100 times worse. And on one hand, I can commiserate with a new person learning because it's a very daunting experience. On the other hand, I think that this is very exciting because as a company like RunPod, we have the opportunity to show people what to do. And to not necessarily tell them, hey, you need to do A, B, and C, but really guide them and say, hey, this is the path that you might want to start on. And to be able to grow with them and to be able to be a part of what does software development look like in the next 5, 10, 20 years, incredibly exciting for me. And I think that that's probably the number one thing that I'm excited about and to be excited to be a part of when I'm leading RunPod.
Okay, as an AI engineer, I literally resonate with your final answer.
Yeah, it's a struggle, man.
Okay. That's a perfect place to end. Zhen, this was absolutely fantastic. It's truly inspiring to hear the vision behind RunPod. I have no doubt our viewers are feeling empowered to start building right now. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to speak to you. I thought that the topics of conversation I'm very, very passionate about. Like I said in the beginning, hopefully this can do a little bit to inspire people, and I'm really excited what people can build in the future.